Can you hear that? Silence, other than birds. Now what you're looking at is the lagoon at the bottom of Limefield Quarry. And it's here back on September 5th, 1900, where today's tale takes us. Peaceful. Now it's amazing after all this time how history seems to just re-emerge. It shows itself. And if you look down, these are the cobbles, the original cobbles that Joseph and John would have walked up over 120 years ago, back in 1900. And for poor Joseph and poor John, obviously this pathway was going to lead to a terrible tragedy, and only one of them were going to return back down this path late that afternoon on September the 5th, 1900. So it was here, September the 5th, 1900, at around 5:30 p.m. when Joseph Holden, 57-year-old Joseph Holden, brought his grandson John Dawes, who was aged just 8 years. He brought him to this area, and within minutes of arriving, he'd literally thrown young John from somewhere off the outcrop of the quarry here, down into the water. Now, at the time, John didn't actually hit the water. Instead, he landed on somewhere soft, which could well have been in that direction. He landed on a soft surface. Now, Joseph had seen the young boy fall, and what he'd done, John, obviously had gone down the embankment, so Joseph had carried on walking down around, I'll just show you guys. He's obviously carried on walking down, probably where we've just taken the walk, down here. He's then took hold of John, who's obviously badly injured. He's got a cracked skull, he's got abrasions to his hands and face, but he's still alive. Now, Joseph, what he did then, he picked up John and he's actually thrown him into the lagoon here and then left. He's left him to drown. Now, for whatever reason, after he'd committed such a vile act on his grandson, Joseph then walked over to Radcliffe. Now, it's not nearby, it's a fair walk. Did he walk or did he get a tram car? We don't know, but anyway, he ended up over in Radcliffe. Railway Street, to be precise, and that's where the Radcliffe police station, well, it was and it still is, but it's obviously the old station's been knocked down since. But when he got there, he came across Sergeant Thomas, who was outside, and he said to Thomas, "Lock me up." Now, Thomas has said to him, you know, in a bemused, like, you know, what do you mean, lock you up? What? Why? He says, "You'll find out, or you'll see." So obviously Sergeant Thomas took him into the police station, which was just a few yards away, and when he's asked him and he's interrogated Joseph as to what's gone on, Joseph's then come out with a tale of throwing his grandson John over the quarry here at Limefield, just on the outskirts of Bury. So obviously they've locked Joseph up at that point, and then they've got in touch with Sergeant Swainbank over in Bury, and they've told him the tale. So Sergeant Swainbank has organised a posse of police officers to come up here into the quarry to basically check the entire lagoon, if you will. Now, this was at midnight. This was at midnight when they came over here, and what they uncovered, it took 5 hours. It was around 5:30 that morning when the body of John was found. Now, at the time, they dragged him out. They've gone back to the police station, And the first thing Joseph said to Swainbank is, "Have you found the clog on the cap?" Meaning John Dawes' one of his clogs on his cap that he was wearing when he threw him down the embankment. Swainbank's turning and said, "Well, no, we've not found that." So curious, Swainbank later on that morning has gone back out, has come up to this area, because obviously daylight's now broken, and that is when he has found the right clog and the cap of John Dawes. Now Joseph told Swainbank at the time that when he threw him down the embankment, down the actual cliffside, that's when he noticed the clog and the cap coming off. But also, what Swainbank found that morning was a large amount of blood on a big stone that obviously John had hit on his way down. And there was also blood 8 foot away from the water's edge. Now, obviously it must have been horrific at the time, because you're talking about an 8-year-old boy. I mean, murder's horrific at any age, but an 8-year-old boy, especially a grandson as well. You know, I mean, it shocked an entire nation. It shocked the police officers who, at the time, obviously interviewed Joseph at the police station. It made all national press, all headlines everywhere. Now, it was reported that when Joseph threw young John over the quarry's edge here, it was around 40 foot. Now, poor John never actually hit the water. In fact, he landed, as I said, somewhere soft. Now, the only place I can see is in that direction where he may well have landed. Could have been further around, but I'm thinking more in that area. So that broke his fall, but like I said, he was full of abrasions, cuts, bruises, severely injured. I mean, a 40-foot drop for a young boy, you know, that is high. Now, the water itself was, at the time, 6 foot deep, roughly. It may well be deeper than that now, because we're talking over 120 years ago when this event took place. But it's very quiet, very silent here. I wouldn't say it's eerie, but it's got something about it. I think it's because we know that a young boy had basically been murdered here, not just drowned, but he was murdered here by his own grandfather, you know, which is shocking. Now, one thing that always fascinates me is when we come and do these videos is we come across things from the past. I mean, this, it seems to be some kind of maybe some old rail line from the quarry, you know, when they used to put the trucks when they were full of the stone, because this is a stone quarry. But yeah, it could well be part of the working infrastructure that was here back in the 1900s. Yeah, it's a good find. I mean, there's still remnants of the work that went on here back when Joseph Holden would have made his trip up here with John. It's just everywhere around us. There is elements of history. And it is crazy to think that this, which seemingly seems tranquil, is the place of an horrific incident that took place all those years ago, 120 years ago, in 1900. So why did he kill his own grandson? Well, for that, we have to go back to his family life just before 1896. Now, prior to that, he was a happily married family man. You know, he loved his kids, he loves his grandkids, he'd do anything for them, and he'd take them to places like this, his grandkids, for walks before he made his way back home later in the evening. But he idolised them, apparently, from all accounts. So what made him do it? Well, it seems that in 1896, when his wife Alice passed away, we don't know from what, but when she passed away, his life went downwards. His life took a downwards path at that point. He turned to drink, He lost his job that same year. Now, we presume he lost his job because of the drinking habits that he was undertaking. From all accounts, some of his family also kind of disowned him, and he blamed them for not helping him out in his time of need. Now, there's no evidence to suggest that, but that is basically what he intimated when it went to courts about, obviously, the inquest and everything that happened with John. There's a bit of a revenge motive in what he did. Now, because of everything that happened, like I said, with his wife losing his job, turning to drink, he ended up going into the Bury Union Workhouse, which is now the Fairfield Hospital, further back in that direction towards the centre of Bury. We're not going to go there because, obviously, with it being a working hospital, we don't want to intrude, and obviously, you get me. But yeah, he was in and out of the workhouse from 1896 up to 1900 several times. Now, he'd be released, he'd start wandering around the streets, mumbling, talking nonsensical to himself. He'd get picked up, he'd be taken back to the workhouse, and it was a vicious circle. But from all accounts, from what I have been reading, is one of his family members, Fanny Eldred, the mother of George, she took him under her wing, if you will. She kind of like let him in to her house. Now, for him to say that the family turned their back on him, but yet Fanny looked after him, kind of contradicts itself. But her husband, who was also called George, because she had a son called George, but her husband George, he had had enough of Joseph's drinking habits, and it came to a point where enough was enough, and he ended up throwing Joseph out onto the streets. Now, this is where the actual vendetta or his calling came from, his hatred, not hatred, that's a strong word, but this is perhaps where he'd had enough and he wanted some revenge because, like I said, he'd been thrown out onto the streets. His other family members, such as Sarah, didn't want to know anything or didn't want anything to do with him. So, where did all this begin? Why here? Why at this quarry? Well, for this, we have to go back to the 21st of August, 1900. So, something had happened. Something had gone on in his head. He wanted revenge, or so people seem to think. Now, what he did on the 21st of August, he went to Fanny's house. And he went to see if young George, her son George, wanted to go with him to collect two pigeons from over in nearby Birtle, which I think is roughly in that direction, somewhere over there. Now, this wasn't an unusual request because, like I said, Joseph spent a lot of time with his grandkids. And even though he'd been thrown out of Fanny and George's house by her husband George, she still thought, she didn't think anything much of it. She just thought, well, he's come round to reconcile. Of course you can take young George with you. He'll enjoy that, because George liked birds. Now, this is where things start to get a little bit dark. Now, as young George and Joseph had made their way over to Birtle, they stopped by in a field near to a quarry similar to this. Not much different to this. Whilst there, Joseph has asked George if he can help him cut some tobacco. Now, this is something George had done a few times before. Now, he's 9 years old, is George, but he still knew how to cut tobacco. Now, while he's there, George is sat down on the floor. He started cutting the tobacco. Behind him, Joseph had picked up a stone, quite a heavy stone. And within seconds, he'd not run up to George, but he's gone up to the back of George and he's banged him on the back of the head with this stone, knocking George to the floor. Now, instantly, back of George's head is started to bleed quite badly. Now, George, still conscious, he's looked up at his grandfather and instantly said, "Grandfather did that on purpose." Now, obviously, Joseph is panicked a little bit here. He's took an handkerchief out of his pocket and he's wrapped it round George's head. They've then walked down the embankments back down to not Walmsley Road, but they've walked down to a main road. And while there, he's put George in a taxi, in a cab, if you will, to go back home back to Ingham Street. Now, when George has got back home at Ingham Street, his mum, Fanny, horrified to see the state he's in. So she's asked George what the hell's gone on, and she said, well, Grandad threw a stone at me. So she's then made her way down to where Joseph was living, and whilst there, Joseph's come out and said, well, I picked up a stone, I was going to throw it past him, but it slipped out my hand because it was full of clay and it was a bit wet, a bit slippery, and it slipped and it hit him on the back of the head. Fanny, you know, quite happy with the excuse. Still not happy that her son's been injured, but she's happy with the excuse, because why would a father injure a grandson, somebody who he idolised? But that was the first setting, the first scene perhaps, of why Joseph did what he did to his other grandson, John Dawes, here, only 2 weeks later, on September the 5th. So what do you think brought us here to the quarry at Limefield? Well, it seems that, like I said, the George Eldred story, or side story if you will, may have been a testing ground for what was to come with young John. Now, on September 5th, about 1:45, Joseph visited Sarah Dawes, that was his other daughter. Now, Sarah Dawes lived only a few streets away on Nuttall Street, close to where Ingham Street is, where we're going to go to shortly. Now, whilst there, he expected to find his daughter there. Anyway, nobody was there. Sarah had left and her son had left and gone back to school. He'd missed them by minutes. So what Joseph did, he then went to St Thomas's School in Pimhall. Now, in Pimhall, there's School Street or School Road, and again, we'll go to there shortly. But when he got to the school, he actually said to the teacher who stopped in, Jane Robinson, she said, what are you doing here? And he said, well, I've come to pick up John Dawes. His mother Sarah's got a chore for him to do at the Sundial. Now, the Sundial is a public house, which if I can, I'll try and get to there on the way out of this quarry. Now, she went and got the head teacher, Edwin Ashton, and said, you know, he asked him the same question. Well, why can't you do the chore? Why can't you go? Why didn't you take John out? But whilst there, Joseph then turned and said, well, I've got another job to do over at nearby Haywood, which is obviously in that direction. So Edwin's let young John leave with his grandfather, you know, unaware as to what we're going to come, because obviously nobody's going to predict what's going to happen shortly after. So as they both left the school, this is where they made their way to, and they didn't get here till around 5:30 that afternoon. Yeah, I mean, it's a strange case, because you could say that when Joseph took George to nearby Birtle for the pigeons, or supposedly pigeons, was that like a testing ground, a testing bed for what was to come with John? We don't know. I mean, we don't know what was going through Joseph's mind at the time. Some say it was a bit insane, he'd lost the plot, but obviously people around him didn't seem to think that. Maybe apart from the workhouse people. I mean, the workhouse governor, I think it was called William Bailey, even he said that when Joseph came into the workhouse, he seemed a normal, sane person, willing to do anything. It might act a bit odd now and again, but otherwise he seemed a nice person. So it seems really out of character why Joseph would do what he did to two grandchildren, two grandkids who he idolised. Like I said, I keep saying it, but he used to take them for walks into these places, spend all afternoon, all day with them, never an ounce of trouble. It really is a strange situation, strange case as to why he did what he did. So this is School Road, and this is where Joseph made his way down from nearby Nuttall Street, where young John Dawes and his mother Sarah lived. And he came down here and he made his way about 3:20 in the afternoon. Now the school has changed. I mean, you can see this is St Thomas's Church of England Primary School. This is where the original school would have stood, but as you can see, it's just all modern now. But this is School Road. Now, he made his way into the school, did Joseph, that morning, or that afternoon I should say, and he basically was approached by a lady called Jane Robinson, a teacher, and she asked him what he was doing in the school premises. Now, Joseph came up with a tale of wanting to take John, his grandson, out to school so he could run an errand for his mum Sarah at the Sundial Inn public house. So obviously Jane's gone to get the head teacher, Edwin Ashton, and he's told the same story to Edwin. Now Edwin asked Joseph, you know, well, why can't you do the errand? Why do you need John to do it? And Joseph said, well, he had to go over to nearby Haywood to do another job. So obviously Edwin didn't think much of it, and he allowed young John to go with his grandfather. And this is the school. Well, this is the place where the school would have once stood. So it was here on Ingham Street at number 48 that George had made his way around to try and see if her son Fanny, Eldred's son George, wanted to go with him over to nearby Birtle to collect 2 pigeons. But as you can see, a lot has changed in that time. You've got, I think, the original houses on the left hand side, but where Fanny lived at number 48 on this row, everything has changed. We've still got the cobbled roads obviously in the back there, but and you've got this building, but as for her house, with redevelopments and whatnot, everything has completely changed. So the Sundial Inn. Now this is where Joseph told Edwin Ashton, the head teacher of St Thomas's School, where he wanted young John Dawes to do some errands for his mother Sarah back on the 5th of September. So the trial of Joseph Holden took place at the Manchester Assizes on 13th November 1900, and it all took place before Judge Mr Justice Darling. Now it was a quick trial from all accounts. The facts were simple. Joseph had admitted to everything. He admitted to killing his grandson John on the 5th of September, as well as also attempting to murder his other grandson George on the 21st of August 1900. Now, like I said, it seemed a quick trial at the time, and the jury and the judge basically found him guilty. Now, obviously the judge had no choice at that time but to issue the full punishment down to Joseph, which was death by hanging. Yeah, now obviously Joseph's now been sentenced to death by hanging, and that would take place on Tuesday 4th of December 1900. Now, leading up to his execution, he was visited twice by family members, one of them being Fanny Eldred, the mother of George, who he attempted to obviously murder back on the 21st. Now, George wasn't allowed in the prison cell because the judge and the governor all thought it was prudent not to obviously let them see each other after what had gone on. So Fanny went in instead, and Joseph reportedly told Fanny and said to Fanny that, "I was a good father once," and Fanny replied, "Yes, you were, father." Now, apparently it was pitiful, you know, there was a lot of hugging, there was a lot of emotion going on at the time. And leading up to the day before his execution and on the day of his execution, Joseph was showing signs of emotion and sorrow and regret for what he did. It was like he accepted that what he did was wrong, because leading up to the actual court case in prison, there was no remorse shown at all. It was only when leading up to his execution. Now, you could say, obviously, because he knew his time was up, you know, I won't say he was going to try and get out of the execution, because obviously that was that. But saying that, a lot of people thought a reprieve would be given, because some people thought he was of unsound mind when he actually committed the murder on John. Now, the Home Secretary, Charles Ritchie, at the time, he got word, obviously, of the execution, and he must have been told, like, you know, he might not have been fully aware of what he was doing and fully aware of his actions at the time. So he sent 2 guys out, medical officers, to give Joseph the once-over, if you will, to make sure, because obviously if he is of unsound mind, they can't go ahead with an execution. You can't execute a lunatic, basically. But all the evidence came back, and the 2 medical officers gave their opinion that Joseph was sound at the time. He knew fully what he was doing, so the execution obviously would go ahead. the Home Secretary told the Governor of Strangeways that he wasn't going to get in touch with Her Majesty to quash the actual execution. It was going to go ahead. And it did go ahead on the 4th of December 1900. Now, James Billington was the executioner, and it was reported that that morning when Joseph had arose from the bed he was lying in at 6 a.m. that morning. Now, he did have a troubled sleep, did Joseph, that night, from all accounts. He couldn't sleep, but when he finally did, he woke up at 6 a.m. that morning. And James Billington came into the prison cell around 7, half 7, just after, I think it was after the chaplain had spoke with Joseph. And he started to pinion him. You know, he put him in the actual cuffs, ready for his execution. Now, also, that morning, Joseph, he didn't have really much to eat for his breakfast. It was reported he had bread and butter and a cup of tea. That was how simple it was. But when James Billington came in, like I said, he didn't show any emotion. He didn't utter a single word while the actual chains and the shackles were being placed onto him. And at 8:02 that morning, the notice went up outside Strangeways, where over 400 people had all aligned. 400 people had come to see and to witness what was about to happen. Now, obviously, they couldn't see much because the actual executions take place behind the prison walls, but they were there out of morbid curiosity from all accounts. So one of the wardens came out, they put the actual notice on the wall, the execution took place, blah, blah, blah. Now, it was only a few days later when a local MP from Bolton in the House of Commons brought up the execution of Joseph, and he asked the Home Secretary, Charles Ritchie, if he actually read through the actual dispositions and the witness testimonies, and was he happy executing an insane man. So obviously Charles Ritchie, the Home Secretary, said, yeah, I did. I read through everything. We went through everything. I got 2 medical examiners out to interview and to speak to Joseph to see if he was of unsound mind. I was quite happy that what they came back with was the truth. He was sane at the time. He knew what he was doing. So we went ahead with the actual execution. Now, another MP from Lanarkshire, he then started to question the Home Secretary on it, and he said, well, are you happy then in executing or finding guilty a lunatic? But it seems that the Speaker of the House was unhappy with all the questioning that the Home Secretary was getting. The South Lanarkshire, the Bolton MP, both of them questioning him on why he went ahead with the hanging of Joseph Holden. So he shut down any further questioning by shouting, order, order. He did not want any more going ahead with this. He wanted all talk stopped there and then. Now, the funeral of John took place on Monday, 10th of September 1900, but it didn't go without its issues. Now, apparently on the way to the actual cemetery, at Bury Cemetery, the first cortege, which contained John's mother Sarah, as well as other family members, it was involved in an accident, in a collision with a greengrocer's cart. Now, the greengrocer's cart has come around a corner leading into the cemetery and gone straight into the side of the carriage of where Sarah Dawes was. I mean, obviously, if she's not upset enough about burying her son, she's had this to contend with. Now, nobody was injured that day, but obviously it shook them all up, and it didn't start, obviously, the day in the best way you can imagine. But yeah, his funeral took place on that Monday, the 10th of September. Now, we've been over to the actual cemetery. We're not going to go back again today, but I'll show you footage of his final resting place. Now, John, obviously because they were a poor family at the time, they couldn't afford the actual gravestone, if you will, the headstone. So instead, there's a little plaque. There's a little plaque there, and then inscribed on it simply is, in loving memory of John Dawes, who died September the 5th, 1900, aged 8 years. Thy will be done. Simple and sweet. So as with many of these cases that we've done, we've done a few where people who have been classed as insane, they've dodged the death penalty. And in Joseph's case, even though it comes across he was insane, the Home Secretary ruled he wasn't. So yeah, his execution took place. Now, I hope you enjoyed this tale. It's a strange one, and it's not a sad one because it involves kids. But what are your thoughts? I mean, should Joseph have been executed? Did he deserve the punishment of the full force of the law, the execution? I mean, a lot of people will say, yeah, because obviously it's his grandkids at the end of the day, and he's taken one life and tried to take another. But was he clinically insane at the time? Had the pressures of losing his wife, losing his job got to him to the point where he's just snapped? comment down below, tell me what your thoughts are on this case. Like I say always, guys, if you've got any recommendations for other stories, comment down below, tell me. But in the meantime, take care, look after yourselves, but don't forget to comment, like and subscribe. See you all later, guys.